Hey everyone. Why is there a marble in your nose? Every experience matters. Think about all of the lessons and skills and understanding that you add to your knowledge as your career in tech continues to grow. As a tester and someone who works in tech, it's important to recognize that we're building things for other people. The more experiences and perspectives that get included in the things we build, the more likely we are to effectively reach a broader audience in a way that benefits them. But it's not just your experience in tech that matters. I don't just bring 4 years of testing with me to my job. I also bring my experiences and knowledge from 8 years of customer service at Disney, and from the time that I spent molding young hearts and minds in the classroom, and from my first role as a developer intern. All of those years and experiences have shaped my perspective, and I want to talk to you today about how my experience as a teacher has influenced and improved who I am as a tester. But who am I as a tester? Being a tester can mean different things to different people. For me, being a tester has involved a lot of process improvements. It's been release management, incident remediation, making recommendations to engineering teams about quality and risk, coaching other testers, and of course, actual testing. Most of these responsibilities call for something that we often refer to as non-technical or soft skills, which is a total misnomer. These soft skills are actually really hard to achieve. I learned and developed my soft skills during my years as a teacher, and I call on those skills every day in my role as a tester. My soft skills are things like adaptability and leadership and cultural awareness, change management, building positive relationships, and the importance of emotions, how to understand the big picture as well as little details, and how to learn from my mistakes. I could spend literally days talking about all of these, but I only have 40 minutes. I won't be able to dive into every topic here, but I want to highlight a few that I think stand out or were especially impactful for me to realize. Let's start with curiosity. Curiosity is all about asking questions and learning from the answers. As a teacher, I once asked the question, "Why is there a marble in your nose?" It was a learning experience. At first glance, the challenge I had to deal with was a kid with a marble up his nose. But that marble wasn't the real challenge. Don't get me wrong, it was a challenge to get that thing out. But that initial why is there a marble in your nose? That led me down a path of questions I hadn't known I needed to ask. And it revealed that the real challenge was the student had outgrown naps and needed something else to do while his classmates were sleeping. Curiosity is defined as a strong desire to know or learn something. That sounds like every tester I've ever met. We're always curious, we always want to know more, and we're always asking questions. What does this do? Who are our users? How does this work? What happens if I do this? And of course, why? Okay, so testers ask a lot of questions. But why is this useful for a tester? People use products in unexpected ways. If you ask the questions while it's still in your hands, users won't have to ask once the product is in theirs. Why did the product manager create this timeline? Why was that feature included as MVP? Why did the architect choose this implementation? How are we testing this? What are our known unknowns? Our curiosity leads to discovery and learning about the thing we're building, figuring out how to test it in different ways, learning different types of testing, discovering our known unknowns and unknown unknowns. As testers, we are constantly learning and discovering new things, new ideas, new tools, new methods. Our curiosity as testers leads to a deeper understanding of the product, the people who are building it, and how your users will interact with it. My curiosity makes me a better tester because it leads me to learn and discover more about the people and systems that I work with. I want to talk about emotions next because it was always one of my favorite things to teach. A quick content note for this section. I'll be using the phrase negative emotions to describe things that make us feel kind of icky. Things like frustration, anxiety, sadness, or anger. But these are not inherently bad things, and experiencing these emotions doesn't make us bad people. It doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong. These emotions mean that we're human and we experience a range of emotions, and negative emotions is just a useful label to use during this talk. The first thing to know about emotions is that people are really bad at emotions. Or I should say, emotions are often really hard for people. People aren't really taught how to identify, understand, and work with their feelings. Emotions are something that just get in the way of the thing you're actually trying to do. We often don't even really know how we're feeling in the moment. How many of you have been angry or nervous or anxious and not realized how you were feeling and how it was affecting you until much later? As a teacher, I learned that emotions can be explicitly taught. We learn all about how our bodies work in school, right? We should learn how our feelings work too. With students, I'd often use the moment to name the emotion. I see that you're frowning and crying a little bit, and it looks like you weren't able to finish that puzzle yet. It seems like you're probably feeling frustrated. Naming it allows the students to begin identifying what they're feeling, to understand that it's a natural thing to feel, and to start having control over how they react to it and how they get through it. Working with my students to understand their emotions made me better at understanding and working with emotions in general. One of the most important things I learned is that having some time to yourself can help when you're having a negative emotion. We had a little tent in the classroom where kids could go when they were feeling too much and needed a break. They could read, or cuddle with a stuffed animal, or play with some puzzle toys. And when they were ready, they could come out and they were okay. They just needed that time and space to work through their negative emotions. As adults, we have the exact same need. As a tester, I've learned that sometimes the conversation about a problem and the conversation about a solution have to be two separate conversations. If a team is feeling stressed because a process is blocking them, it's hard to have a useful conversation about it. Offering solutions in that moment may not be helpful, and I've learned to say, this process seems like it has some blockers. Let's get through today and meet up tomorrow to think about longer-term solutions. Understanding emotions is also understanding that people may be having emotional reactions to things outside of work or school. We bring our whole selves to work. My students didn't leave their emotions at the door when they walked into the classroom, and we don't really leave problems at home when we go to work. Emotions are hard. With my students, I taught them about emotions so they could cope with them. With adults, it's different. I may not be teaching them about their emotions, but my experience allows me to recognize and identify how they might be feeling in certain situations so I can adjust my response and my expectations. If a student is struggling because they're sad or angry or anxious, they may not have the ability to also do their homework. They may not have the capacity to ask nicely when they want a toy that someone else is using. And it's the same for adults. When someone is feeling negative emotions, whether it's work-based or home-based, their capacity for working effectively is reduced. As a tester, I work with other people on a daily basis. Being able to understand how emotions affect people's reactions and interactions allows me to work more productively with my colleagues. Being able to recognize and work with other people's feelings is something that requires empathy. We like to think of empathy as innate. People either have it or they don't. But that's not true. Empathy is a learned skill, and it's something I taught my students when I was a teacher. It can be as simple as telling another student, "Toby tripped and fell, let's go see if they're okay," and letting my student be the one to help them up and ask if they're all right. And we can probably agree that more kids with more empathy is a good thing. But why is empathy important in tech? It's just computers, right? Building software with people demands empathy. Empathy helps me understand that an engineer might be annoyed or disappointed if I find a bug that blocks their work from getting released. It helps me understand how our customer support team will feel when they're overwhelmed with calls because the site went down. Empathy helps me understand the people I'm working with, so we can successfully build and launch the services and applications that we work on together. Building software for people also demands empathy. It helps me understand that a user would feel left out or unseen if the gender dropdown on our form is limited to binary choices. It helps me understand that a user might feel frustrated if our site isn't keyboard accessible for them to navigate. Empathy motivates me to approach my work more holistically, to see how the choices I make affect other people, and to bring that awareness to my role, my relationships, and my work. Empathy makes me a better tester by allowing me to better understand the people I'm working with and the people I'm building for. We've been covering a lot of information in a short amount of time, so feel free to take a quick drink of water or write down a question you want to ask later, or just enjoy these puppies for a moment. Leading through influence. As a teacher, I learned how to lead through influence rather than relying on authority. While I may have the appropriate authority as a teacher, and sometimes the best solution really is because I said so, that's not the most effective way to operate on a daily basis. Have you ever watched a kid do a chore they don't want to do, that they're only doing because you made them do it? Do you know how slowly a kid can move in situations like this? It's physically painful to endure. As a teacher, offering chores as a way to help was a great way to influence my students. 3- and 4-year-olds always want to help. They're at an age where they want to imitate the things they see you doing. They want attention from an adult who's important to them, and they want to be a part of the things you do. Influencing them through their motivation to help had much better results than simply telling them, "Clean up because I said so." All of my leadership work as a tester has been as an individual contributor, which means I haven't had the authority to back up my initiatives and opinions, especially to people who outrank me. I've had a call on my experience as a teacher to lead through influence as a tester. As a tester, I lead through influence when I ask an engineer to make some adjustments to their pull request. I don't have the authority to make them change it, but I can pair with them to explain why I'm asking for the change. I lead through influence when I'm trying to get director approval on a policy update. I don't have the authority to push the policy through on my own, but I can show the benefits of the new policy and why it's important to have in place for the company or the department. And I lead through influence when I propose a change to our team process. I don't have the authority to make this decision for the whole team, but I can lean on our trust and relationships to get them to try it out and see how it works. Leading through influence is all about building relationships and trust with people. It requires getting people's buy-in, working with them to implement decisions, and showing them why they should care about helping your decision get made. And just like leading people, teaching people takes skill and practice. As a teacher, one of the things I learned about teaching was the zone of proximal development. This zone is the place between something that a student can do fully on their own and something the student cannot do at all, even if they had help. The zone of proximal development is something that the student can do if they have some guidance. That zone means they're being challenged and they're going to struggle a bit, and that's where your guidance comes in. You're not solving it for them, but you're giving them a bit of a boost so they can learn how to solve the problem. As a teacher, I used modeling, group work, and think, pair, share to help my students learn in the zone of proximal development. As a tester, these methods work just as well. I've used modeling to onboard engineering teams to automated testing. I'll start by running through the automation setup, write out a couple of failing and passing tests for them. Then I'll work with the engineers to run through the same steps so they can start learning the process and how to think about it on their own. You might think that we don't really do group work in the real world, but what if we called it mob programming? Marat Payaharavi has talked extensively about this and is even writing a book about it. Mob programming allows people to combine their experience and ideas while tackling the same problem together, which often allows for a more timely solution. It also forces you to practice enhanced communication so you can get your ideas across clearly to the person who's driving. And how many of you senior testers have paired with a junior to help teach them? Juniors, how many of you have asked a senior to pair so you can learn something? Lisi Hawk's testing tour is a great example of this. She's paired with people literally all over the world and used their experience and knowledge to improve her own, from automation to debugging to pen testing. Whether I'm teaching students or teaching coworkers, helping people learn in the zone of proximal development results in the greatest learning gains. People like to be challenged, and we learn, retain knowledge, and improve the most when we succeed at something that challenges us. Let's talk about attention. One of my biggest lessons as a teacher was understanding that you get the behaviors you give attention to. Students want to know that their teachers are invested in them. They want to know that their teachers care about and pay attention to the things they do. It's hard for kids to sit still, especially if they're excited about something. One of my students used to get so excited during group reading that she would shout out what happened next or jump up with questions that she was curious about. It would be so easy to meet her with a response like, "Interrupting is rude, you need to sit down." But what does that accomplish? It just discourages her obvious love of stories and reading. It also sets a pattern for what types of behavior get feedback from me as a teacher. Loud outbursts now equate to getting attention. A better response is to focus on the positive. I love that you're excited about this story. She's excited about the book and she wants to participate. These are things all teachers dream of. I can encourage improvements in behavior by acknowledging her positive motivation. I can build in breaks during the story where I ask students to tell me what happens next, which gives her a valid reason to speak up. I can let her stand up while I read the book, so she doesn't have to force herself to sit still when she's excited. This all means that I'm focusing attention on the positive aspects of her behavior and removing focus from the parts I don't want. Since I'm giving attention to enthusiasm for learning and active participation, that's the behavior I'll continue to see grow. The same principles apply to the workplace. As a tester on a central team, I often coordinate remediation for major incidents or help troubleshoot more minor ones. There are times where the easy response, and the response I really want to say is, "How did you miss this? I can't believe you didn't catch that bug." But that's not productive or useful, and it edges really close to blame. Instead, I try to phrase my feedback in a way that gives attention to the behavior I want to encourage. "Nice work getting that incident resolved." This rephrasing allows us to focus on the positive, a team that was quick to triage, investigate, and resolve an incident. The rephrasing isn't always easy, but it helps avoid the potential for a negativity bias to be triggered. A negativity bias can take several forms. For instance, we're more likely to recall the negative feedback we received over positive feedback, even from the same person. We have a tendency to dwell longer on negative events and replay them in our minds. And negative experiences tend to register more quickly and with more detail in our brains, whereas positive experiences are often more vague in memory and slower to be retained in our long-term memory. There's a ratio that gets tossed around, and while it may not be a scientifically accurate number, it does speak to that imbalance of negative and positive interactions. The 5-to-1 ratio says it takes 5 positive experiences to make up for 1 negative experience. So a single criticism, "I can't believe you missed that bug," has more impact, has more weight to it than 5 times I gave positive feedback to that person or team. Testers give feedback all the time. We need to consider attention and negativity bias in our jobs. Code reviews on a pull request, coordinating remediation for an escaped defect, coaching junior testers. If our interactions fall into a negativity bias, our feedback will be less effective, and it hurts our relationships with the people around us. Think about how you give feedback. How do you give it? How often? And for what situations? Do you only give feedback when something bad happens, or do you explicitly call out in the moment when something's gone well? Do you always ask for change with your feedback, or do you also point out where somebody's solution was better and maybe something you hadn't thought of? You get the behaviors you give attention to. As much as possible, focus on the behaviors and relationships you want to encourage. Avoid falling into the negativity bias, and remember that 5-to-1 ratio as you interact with the people around you. Part of effective feedback is also effective communication, one of those soft skills that's really a core skill and incredibly vital to working well as a teacher or as a tester. Communication is carried out through your writing, your speaking, and how you interact with people. Effective communication also recognizes that different audiences require different styles of communicating. More or less formal language, whether face-to-face is needed or an email is good enough. How much you want to get into the technical weeds versus talking about it at a higher level. Teaching is a form of continuous communication. Emails, parent meetings, state documentation, progress reports, and of course, teaching my students. There's different audiences: my director at the school, my students, parents, the Department of Education. I'm not going to use the same type of language for the Oregon Department of Education as I do with a 4-year-old. Being able to communicate effectively to both groups takes practice and skill. Testing is also a form of continuous communication. Code reviews, test cases, user docs, release management. Communication and testing is being able to speak technically with engineers about their work and talk about business requirements with product managers. It's being able to write user docs for the customer support team and technical specs for other engineers. I was part of a panel earlier this year, and the topic was communication and testing. During the panel, someone defined communication as a way of transferring ideas, which I think is a great perspective. And it's not just you trying to get your ideas across, it's also the ability to effectively receive somebody else's ideas. Communication is verbal. It's about tone and language and emphasis. Communication is written. Can you describe your ideas in writing in a way that someone else can use? Think of asking questions on a pull request, writing test automation, or creating technical documentation for an API. Communication is listening, truly listening, so the speaker knows you're giving attention to their ideas, not just waiting for your turn to speak. This lets the speaker know that their perspective and their opinion is valued, and they're able to freely share with you. Communication is collaborating. Can you work with someone else to combine your separate ideas and move them forward together? Communication is understanding and being understood, and allowing that shared understanding to make you and your work more productive and more useful. Communication happens all the time, whether or not you intend it to happen. As a tester, being a good communicator means I have more awareness and more control over the intentional and unintentional communication that happens every day. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about perspective. Perspective is about time and distance. Perspective is being able to understand the big picture, but also being able to focus on the small details, seeing the forest and the trees. It's about short-term and long-term planning. What needs to happen this day or this week, and what needs to happen over the next quarter or even the next year. It's about seeing a solution from the high-level view of the whole company's needs and being able to drill down and see the dependencies of individuals and teams. Perspective is also something that calls back to empathy, being able to understand someone else's point of view. The person on your left can only see 4, and the person on your right will only ever see 3. They need to make the effort to understand what the other person is seeing. I know this is a little bit blurry, but can somebody tell me what they see here in this picture? Giraffes, yes. I don't know why they're eating each other's tails, but yes, it's 2 giraffes. But what if we looked at this from a different perspective? No. Instead of 2 giraffes, we see an elephant. And we never would have seen the difference if we didn't make the effort to walk around and see what someone else might be seeing. I can think about the process of daily releases for my team and create long-term plans for rolling out large feature changes to our users. I understand the time and effort it takes to release a small bug fix compared to the time and effort of creating a response policy for handling future defects. I see the importance of doing acceptance testing as each new pull request comes along, and also see the need for planning end-to-end testing that covers the whole application. Understanding the balance of perspective makes me a better tester, because it means I'm not siloing my point of view or understanding. All of these skills and more have served me well as a teacher and as a tester. I don't have time to hit all of the remaining topics in depth, but here are some quick additional examples I wanted to share with you. Adaptability. As a tester, the only constant is change. Trisha Chitani talked about this a little bit in her presentation yesterday, when she described how she had to keep iterating to solve the problem of her team's flaky tests. As a tester, I've often had to pivot in response to new information, whether it's my team's needs or something from the system I'm testing. Being able to adjust and iterate smoothly is a useful skill. Change management. Change is hard. Jenny Bramble touched on this in her talk yesterday about building automation engineers from scratch. As a tester, being able to help guide your team effectively through change is incredibly valuable. Cultural awareness. Understanding that the people I'm working with and the people I'm building for aren't all like me. This has come up during form field validation, where I had to speak up and tell my team that they were making limited assumptions about who was using our site, and the name fields needed to allow special characters like hyphens and apostrophes. Core needs. I love Paloma Medina's biceps model for core needs, which are belonging, improvement, choice, equality, predictability, and significance. Core needs affect everything and everyone. Anna Marie's tutorial on Tuesday had a section about intrinsic desires, and each intrinsic desire or motivation actually called back to one of these core needs. All of these perspectives, these experiences and skills that I gained as a teacher have influenced and improved who I am as a tester. Every experience matters. All of these skills and experiences made me a great teacher, and they make me a great tester. My hope is that this talk inspires you to appreciate your path into testing or tech, however winding or wandering it may have been, and to understand how all of these things have contributed to making you better at your jobs. Thank you.
Open season.
And also, that link is the link to my slides if you are interested, but they'll also be in the Slack channel for my talk later today. Also, I like questions, so if you have questions, feel free to ask. I believe you. We should be. Try this guy.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
I was slow to write the core needs that you talked about last, but can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So core needs are the 6 main needs that everybody has from childhood to adulthood. The needs are belonging, improvement, choice, equality, predictability, BIC, and significance. All the things that motivate us in some way call back to one of those core needs. I can also add a link to the Slack channel with Paloma Medina, who kind of created that acronym for them, BICEPS. I talk about it a lot in my quality of culture talk. You're welcome.
Any more green cards? Yeah, 87.
Do you apply your teaching skills to actually teaching other people on your team, like having workshops, classes, helping them with testing skills, or anything like that?
Yeah. So far, most of my teaching is small group. A lot of it comes with onboarding new testers or junior testers to the team or company. So going through them and making sure, doing things like the modeling and the group work and the pairing. I do, we do, you do is a really useful skill where I'll do something and then we'll do it together and then you'll do it on your own. So it does come up in lots of small ways all the time.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. Like, it was really, really good and helped open my eyes up to a lot of different things. I can tell you, I can think very negatively sometimes with how something happened and be like, hey, why did you do this? You were so dumb. You shouldn't have done that. Like, I won't verbalize it, but it's like in my head, and I try more and more and more, to get out of that because it's not a good headspace to be in, and it doesn't help affect change. So I was wondering, what are some skills you use to help better communicate more positively and think more positively and kind of get out of that mindset?
Sure. So the question is, how do I get myself out of a negative mindset so that I can communicate more positively? A lot of it is just being aware of my bias to react that way sometimes. I know that my knee-jerk reaction can sometimes be, what did you do? Why did you do that? I can't believe it. So really just being mindful and knowing that about myself and not saying the first thing that comes to mind. So taking like a couple seconds before I say something, or letting it go until later and maybe doing like a debrief session after the thing you were doing together to talk about it.
You made a reference to something I'm not familiar with, or maybe I misheard you. Lucy Hawk's testing tour?
Yes, I can throw a link in the channel as well. Lucy Hawk is a tester who's done both in person and remote pairing with other testers and developers all over the world in order to learn new skills and improve her testing. Yeah, a lot of people in this room have paired with Lucy Hawk.
I thought what you said about emotions being able to be taught was really interesting. Do you have any books or reading more about that topic?
I do. They're all kids' books, but they're still fun to read. There's a couple that talk about colors in relation to emotions, which is super useful for helping people express their emotions in different ways. They really are all kids' books, but I would still recommend them. I think there's still things that we can learn from, and I can throw some titles in the Slack channel as well.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Any more cards? Okay. Looks like we are all good. So if we don't have any more cards, that brings into a wonderful session. And a big round of applause for Angela.
Thank you so much.
Ashik, you got something to ask? Yeah. Okay. No, we got time.
Yeah.
I'll just speak up. Empathy. Empathy is a word that's thrown around often. I love that you talk about it in the way that we as testers are better when we exemplify the quality of empathy. You also talked about how it can be learned. I'm very curious how you go about teaching empathy, mostly because when interviewing, when talking with individuals, when trying to assist them in understanding the concept of empathy, there's always a loss of words around that for myself as well as the people around me. And so I'm just curious how someone else handles that.
So the question is, how do you teach empathy? I assume as adults, not as kids, which have two different answers sometimes. But so for adults, a lot of teaching empathy, and it's something that I constantly reteach myself, a lot of it is self-talk. I'll have an interaction with somebody, and maybe it doesn't go that great. And I come away feeling like annoyed or kind of pissed off at that person. Some of it is self-talk in considering what pressure are they under that made them react that way. Why are they thinking this way? What business pressures do they have that I can't see that may be impacting their decision or how they spoke or what their word choice was? I have a really good manager, and he and I do that kind of back and forth a lot. And if you can find someone, kind of an empathy buddy, to pair with you and to be like, hey, I just want to talk through this, kind of rubber ducking it. It helps a lot just to kind of use immediate examples to think through and think about, what is that person seeing that I'm not? And how does my reaction remove empathy from the situation? And how can I add that back in by seeing what they were doing?